Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, this isn't a very long video that we're taking a look at today, but it's from Jack Rackham. It came out a few months ago, and it's one I've kind of kept in my back pocket. I knew I'd eventually take a look at. It's called Abraham Lincoln versus Literally Everyone, and I'll put the link down in the description so you can check it out without my commentary. I have no idea what he's going to cover in this video. I only see the title, and I'm curious to know if it has to do with like people who are criticizing Lincoln in modern times. Is it Lincoln back when he was running for the Republican nomination and was kind of an underdog against some very well-known favorites for that nomination? So I have no idea what's going to happen with that one, but we're going to check it out and we're going to see, and we'll react to it as we go along. I want to thank Sean in Bristol, Rhode Island. Rhode Island, one of two states I haven't been to yet, but I am remedying that. I have plans to head to Rhode Island at the end of September, so that'll give me State 49, and then all eyes are on Utah after that. All right, let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Slavery! That was a thing in America, but then by 1804, half of America got rid of it, and the other half lost their about it.
That's a great point. We forget that at the time of the American Revolution, slavery was still perfectly legal in most of the North, and many northern states still had it, though they never had it to the level that the South did. What changed then? Well, a couple of things changed. Number one, people started outlawing it in the North, but in the South, with the development of the cotton gin, cotton suddenly became a very lucrative commodity to produce if you had slave labor. And it could only be grown in the South. It couldn't be grown in the North. If the cotton gin hadn't been invented, there's a decent chance that slavery eventually dies of natural causes in the United States because it just wasn't profitable. But that made it incredibly lucrative. And then when the Constitution was adopted in 1787, I have a loud streak today. Constitution was adopted in 1787. One of the provisions in there was that the slave trade, in other words, importing new enslaved people to the United States, could be outlawed after 20 years. And pretty much exactly when that 20 years hit, during the administration of Thomas Jefferson, slavery is outlawed. So now those existing enslaved people are an even more lucrative commodity because you can't legally import anymore.
Slave states are afraid that if they get outnumbered, then the free states are going to gang up on them and take away their slaves. So they reached a compromise. When new states get added, Missouri and everybody south of this line will be pro-slavery, and everybody north will be anti-slavery.
So the Missouri Compromise, and that doesn't last very long. And one of the things we talk about a lot, but if you're new to the channel, basically every major decision that happens in the United States, every political crisis, every election cycle, slavery is at the forefront of our politics from the time of the Constitution through the end of the American Civil War. And so you have these compromises, you have fights over adding new states, and every issue that comes about, like Texas being admitted to the Union, for example, slavery is kind of lurking in the shadows as an underlying cause of many of the issues that we deal with.
But the slave states never trust the free states. They want slavery in as many states as possible, so they start scheming. One proposal was to get a bunch of new slave states by conquering all of Central America. That never got traction from the government, but one guy and his friends did take over part of Mexico for a minute there. His name was William Walker. He also made himself president of Nicaragua and killed 10% of Costa Rica along the way. Guy was insane. No, the slave states would do what they do best: whine. Because not only do the slave states have slaves, they also get to vote on behalf of their slaves.
Yep.
Or at least 3/5 of them.
Yeah, so the 3/5 compromise, honestly, I mean, so many of our problems could have been dealt with if they would have just found a way to deal with this issue when the Constitution was adopted. But the slave states, one of the only ways that they would agree to a constitution is if they got to count 3/5 of their enslaved population as population for the sake of apportionment of the of Congress. And so you can see why they would fight for that. Why? Because if you only count the white population in the South, they get very few representatives in Congress, and now the North has a strong advantage in the House, and they can use that advantage to systematically whittle away at slavery. So funny how they weren't considered citizens, they weren't considered human beings, they were chattel, they were property, but we'll still count them toward our Representatives.
Secession they won from the Founding Fathers by whining. So now, in 1854, they roll into Congress and put that power to use. They get rid of the anti-slavery force field dividing the country and say from now on, every time there's a new state, that state gets to vote if it wants to do slavery or not.
One of the most disastrous decisions our country ever made was to adopt the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which eliminated the provisions of the Missouri Compromise. It basically overturned the Compromise of 1850 and led directly to the Civil War. And you have guys like Stephen Douglas, who was a Northerner, a Northern Democrat, who was instrumental in making this happen. Of course, Franklin Pierce, and it was a disaster.
By which, of course, they mean hordes of Southerners will storm the booths to vote for slavery, and hordes of Northerners will storm the booths to fight them, and then they'll kill each other in the streets, like they did in Kansas.
Yep.
Abraham "This is dumb" Lincoln is a lawyer in Illinois who thinks this is dumb.
So Lincoln served one term in Congress as a Whig in the 1840s. Representing Illinois, and he fought against things like the Mexican War because he knew that that was something that was all a result of the desire to have territory in the South that could allow for the expansion of slavery. And so he was opposed to the expansion of slavery, and when he runs for the Senate in the 1850s, he's going to come to national prominence in speaking out against a lot of these issues.
South already has slavery. They don't get to smear it all over the rest of the country. So he becomes a senator and then runs for president in one of...
He was never a senator. He ran twice for the Senate. The first time he ran for the Senate, he had a good chance of winning. Back then, up until about 100 years ago, the Senate, senators were determined by the state legislature. They weren't voted on by the people. And the state legislature was down to Lincoln and another guy, and they couldn't really, neither guy had the votes, and so Lincoln kind of backed off and said, okay, let the other guy have the seat. And then the second time he runs against Stephen Douglas, but the Democrats win control of the Illinois House of Representatives, and so they get to determine the senator, and they choose Douglas.
Of the weirdest elections the U.S. ever had. Because of the way America counts votes, every election goes back and forth between two parties, and in the 1800s, that was the Whigs and the Democrats. When the Whig Party crashed and burned in 1852, the Democrats became the ultimate big tent party, but the tent got too big and they couldn't agree on anything. So now,
And we talk about this all the time. When you have an opponent, you can stay united. The minute you don't have an opponent anymore, now you start fighting amongst yourselves, and that happened to the Democrats. It happened to the Democratic Republicans, which were their forebears, where they became kind of the only party. And so the Republican Party, when it comes along in the 1850s, is finally the party that is established that becomes the alternative to the Democrats and will remain so to the present day.
Crucial tipping point, there are four parties. The Northern Democrats, the Southern Democrats, a bunch of Whig refugees, and the Republicans. The Republicans are a brand new...
And the Whig refugees end up running in 1860 as the Constitutional Party. John Bell is their nominee. You have Stephen Douglas for the Northern Democrats, John C. Breckinridge, who was the sitting vice president, as the Southern Democrat nominee.
Group where all the abolitionists go to party, and they want Lincoln to be their man. But Lincoln wants everybody to know he's not one of those radicals who thinks slave states should stop holding an entire race of people hostage. He just wants to go back to the way things used to be, where the South was a horrifying dystopia and everybody else could just ignore it.
So it wasn't that Lincoln didn't want abolition. Lincoln was a very pragmatic politician, and he understood that slavery was protected by the Constitution. Until you change the Constitution, you can't deal with slavery where it already exists. But what you do have the power to do is prevent it from spreading to new territories. And so the Republican Party, this brand new party, has wings to it, has factions. It has the radical Republicans, as they're called, who are the abolitionists. These are the people that are eventually going to not only want abolition, but want equality for the formerly enslaved people, citizenship, things like that. You have conservative Republicans, many of them out in places like Missouri. That's like the Blairs, Edward Bates, people like that. You have moderates like Lincoln, who kind of are trying to pull all of it together. And so nobody can agree on, like, Edward Bates is running for the Conservatives. You have guys like Seward and Salmon Chase from Ohio, Seward's from New York, who are strong for the radical side, especially Chase is a radical. Seward's a little more moderate. None of them have the votes for the nomination, and so Lincoln kind of becomes everybody's second choice.
His name isn't Abraham, read my lips, I will not free the slaves, Lincoln. The vote splits 4 ways across the country, and Lincoln cruises to a victory with under 40% of the popular vote. Despite Lincoln's deep commitment to being a moderate who will kick the can down the road as long as possible, the South...
Again, I understand why it's being sold that way, but it was much more about... One of the brilliant things about Abraham Lincoln was that he was very good at understanding what he could do, what he could get away with, and what wasn't possible. He didn't get so far out in front of the popular sentiment in the country that he found himself on an island. He kind of read the pulse and then acted and led. And he only led as opportunities presented themselves.
Thinks he's coming to take our slaves. I am changing one law. I abducted these babies fair and square, and I'll whip them if I want to. The South secedes and makes their own country.
So the South secedes not because they believed that Lincoln was imminently going to abolish slavery, but they understood that by the Republicans not only taking the White House, but also taking Congress, which they did, that they could systematically weaken the South because now they controlled the power to spread slavery to new territories. And by controlling that power, eventually the South was going to find itself in a minority in Congress, and then it would just be the simple act of voting to pass a constitutional amendment, and the South wouldn't be able to stop it. So they're thinking down the road.
Where all men are free to enslave other men. Lincoln orders a militia to put down the rebellion, but mobs in Maryland attack Union troops and sabotage the rail lines.
Yep.
Lincoln declares, fine, no trial for you, and starts hauling people off.
So this is one of the things that a lot of people criticize, like some of the videos we've reacted to in the past, where Lincoln suspends habeas corpus. And the Constitution does allow for the suspension of habeas corpus. In other words, people can be arrested without trial or without being charged with a specific crime. But it seems to heavily imply that it gives that power to Congress and not the president. The problem was Congress couldn't come into session yet because of the rebellion that was happening. And so Lincoln unilaterally suspends habeas corpus, at least until they can get Congress in to vote on it. And Congress does come in and agree with Lincoln and pass the suspension of habeas corpus and give him the power to do that. But the Supreme Court initially steps in. Roger Taney, this is a terrible Supreme Court. This is the same Supreme Court that ruled in Dred Scott that black people couldn't be citizens and had no standing to bring things to trial.
Supreme Court Chief Justice tries to tell Lincoln that he needs permission from Congress to violate the Constitution like that, but Abraham, how about
It's not a violation of the Constitution. The Constitution literally says habeas corpus can be suspended in times of rebellion. You can argue it's Congress's job and not the president's, but you can't say it's unconstitutional for Congress to do it.
I do anyway? Lincoln ignores the ruling, creating an example that will never cause problems in U.S. history ever again. So it looks like the South's hissy fit is going to be a whole thing that Lincoln has to deal with for the next 4 years, so he'd better start talking to his generals. General George McClellan, at your service. George digs in to defend the capital and wins the Battle of Antietam. And as Confederate General Robert E. Lee makes his...
Wins is a bit of a stretch. It's more of a tactical draw, but it's a strategic victory because Lee retreats to the south. In spite of McClellan, not because of him. McClellan should have already taken Richmond earlier that year if he'd have been any kind of general at all.
Escape. McClellan is in hot pursuit. He takes one step forward, looks left, looks right,
and does
looks
nothing.
Left again, takes another step forward, looks left. If you're not going to use the army, do you mind if I borrow it? Lincoln replaces...
He literally said that too.
McClellan with General Burnside.
So Lincoln waits until the midterm elections in November of 1862 when the Republicans hold the House to fire Democrat George McClellan, who's going to come back and run as the nominee in 64. He literally fires him the day after the elections.
Who says, "I'll charge after the enemy," launches an unprompted assault and loses. He gets replaced
I wouldn't say unprompted. He was pretty much forced into attacking. Lincoln's behind him saying, go, 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 go now.
by General Hooker. Where do they find these guys? Hooker loses. He gets replaced by Meade. Who does...
I like the little hitting him over the head there. That's pretty much why he lost. He got concussed by an artillery shell. And even though all his generals were saying, fight, we can win this battle, and Chancellorsville was a very winnable battle even after that great surprise attack by Stonewall Jackson, Hooker just lost confidence and retreated. But understand that Hooker is going to come back later and lead an army in the Western Theater and do quite well.
Is the same thing McClellan did. All right, they're retreating. Okay, we're watching them. Yeah, let's watch them.
Now, listen, I will not stand for Meade criticism on him not pursuing Lee after Gettysburg. Anybody who thinks Meade should have acted more decisively in pursuing Lee after Gettysburg, I encourage you to read the book Meade at Gettysburg by Kent Masterson Brown. It will completely change your mind on that. Meade's army was in no position, was in no condition to pursue Lee. Meade needed 30,000 pairs of shoes. We think of shoes as being something the Confederates needed. Meade's army, a lot of them were barefoot at the Battle of Gettysburg. A lot of them didn't eat for 3 days at the Battle of Gettysburg. His army needed reprovisioned. It needed shoes. It needed weapons. It needed ammunition. It needed rest. It needed reorganization. And literally the day he finally got everybody in place and was ready to attack Lee was the day that Lee got back across the river.
And, Mr. President, we seized a ship carrying 2 Confederate envoys. Their captain wants to talk to you. You bloody bellend, keep your mitts off our ships.
This happened way earlier than the middle of 1863, the Trent Affair. This was a couple of Confederate diplomats that went down, I think, to Cuba or somewhere in the Caribbean, got on a British ship and were on their way to deal with the British government when they were stopped by an American Navy ship and they were taken off the ship. It caused a big diplomatic hubbub with the British. Eventually they were released back and allowed to go on their way.
Britain declares war on us. I will personally strangle you. A few of Lincoln's generals tried to free the slaves they came across, but Lincoln quickly put the kibosh on that.
So David Hunter's one of them. Was John C. Fremont the other one? I think it was. They basically understand all these generals. They didn't initially command armies. They commanded departments, and the armies that were formed in their departments became their armies. And so some of these generals in departments like in Missouri just decided that any slaves that ran from their masters and came to the protection of Union lines, that they were going to be freed and they were going to put them to work. They called them contraband. And some of these generals just declared emancipation in their departments, and they didn't have the authority to do that. And Lincoln had to overturn that. But eventually it happened several times to where he finally says, okay, here's the Emancipation Proclamation. It basically did what some of these other generals like Hunter did, but it did it for the whole country, and it came from the president.
A few slave states had stayed loyal to the Union, and freeing slaves all willy-nilly might make them change their minds.
Yeah.
So a year later, Lincoln rolls out a new plan. Listen here, you ungrateful little just for that
So it was a year after some of those generals, but our timeline's a little off here again. This happened before Gettysburg, before Meade was commander. He issues the preliminary proclamation in September of 62 after the Battle of Antietam, and then it officially takes effect on January 1st of 1863, and that's when he issues the final wording for it.
I'm gonna take your slaves. And he passes the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all the slaves in the Confederacy.
It's an executive order. It's basically a military proclamation, and some people argue, well, wait a second, it doesn't really free any slaves. Well, it did, and it had the effect of communicating to the South that we're serious about this being a war aim now. It's not just about restoring the Union. It's about restoring the Union that's going to look differently. And it was a first major step to get the Northern public as well as the international community on board with the idea that the post-war United States is not going to have slaves.
The Union was able to divide and conquer the South by seizing control of the Mississippi River, which was kind of the only trading route the South had going for them. They only turned a profit when millions of people worked for free. Not exactly an economic superpower, are they? And when the war was finally over, Lincoln got an idea. Lincoln was actually not a big ideas guy. I mean, he was plenty smart, but he really just wanted to get in the White House, get rid of that one frickin' Kansas law, put the anti-slavery force field back, and call it a day.
I totally disagree with that. Lincoln had a number of ideas about things. I mean, they passed the Homestead Act. There was a lot of domestic stuff that was going on. It's just he didn't get a chance to deal with any of that because he was dealing with the war from the time he took office. Abraham Lincoln was an absolutely brilliant politician, probably the most brilliant politician who has ever been president. Read the book Team of Rivals. You will see how Lincoln handled some really, really difficult situations brilliantly. He wasn't perfect. The way he dealt with some of his generals and the way he conducted the war was at times not the best. And I think he did more harm than good with kind of micromanaging his generals at times. But I think a lot of that came because of the bad experience he had with George McClellan, which led to him micromanaging the next couple of generals after him. But then he finally backs off when Grant comes in. But no, Lincoln was way more than just a guy that was coming in to restrict the spread of slavery.
But he takes the opportunity to amend the Constitution and declare once and for all that no one is allowed to enslave anyone.
The House passes the 13th Amendment in 1864. The Senate does it in January of 65. If you've seen the movie Lincoln, that's all about the Senate. I'm backwards. The Senate passes it in 64. The House passes it in 65. And the movie Lincoln is all about the debate in the House over passing the 13th Amendment.
Except for the government, if they decide you really deserve it. The slave states who had
It says in there, except in situations where someone has been given due process and convicted of a crime, then they can be sentenced to involuntary servitude.
Gotten to keep their slaves earlier were not happy, but what were they going to do about it, secede? As for the South, Lincoln was focused on getting them back up on their feet and moving as quickly as possible. There was a chance for real sweeping reform here as millions of Americans entered the body politic for the first time, but Lincoln said, "Dude, that's your problem. I'm just here because making more slave states was dumb." And then he got shot by 1800s Robert Downey Jr. The Union was left to rebuild the South without him, and sadly, rebuilding civilization doesn't come with a handbook, or it didn't until recently. I've been reading this book,
especially when the president who takes over after Lincoln is assassinated is a Southerner,
called The Book. It's a literal guide to rebuilding civilization and today's sponsor, and it's definitely
interesting. All right, that was good. That gave us a lot to talk about. Obviously, anytime we're dealing with the Civil War and things like that, I can go on and on and on for a long time. But I hope you enjoyed that. Definitely check out Jack Rackham and all of his content if you like what you saw. I want to thank Harvey in Winsford in the UK, as well as Walker in Chandler, Arizona, for your support on Patreon. If you want to learn more about supporting the channel on Patreon, the link is in the description. Thanks for watching.